All right, well, welcome. Good to see everybody. The dynamics just now when everybody looked at each other like, I guess we sit down now. So like y'all did very well. No one is still standing, so without having to be told. So thank you so much for being here. It's great to see everybody. It is it's Super Bowl Sunday, which always. I was a pastor in Texas for a long time, and let me tell you something about Texans. They don't come to church on Super Bowl Sunday. So the fact that you're here at all is kind of impressive because Texans have briskets to smoke, they have like face paint to put on, and they have a lot of intensity to muster up before the game starts. And so I'm glad to see we're a lot more chill about things here. Either that or you're like, oh my gosh, it's Super Bowl Sunday. We got to go get some food now. So sorry for me if I just broke the news to you, then you probably care about it about as much as I do, quite frankly. So anyway, it's an odd Sunday, and Ashley talked about this a second ago. And before we get into the sermon, I do want to just sort of acknowledge the massive elephant in the room, which is the sudden departure of our music pastor, Matt. And so, and I know a lot of you received an email, and the elders are going to talk more about this in a bit, but I do want to just, before we get into, because what I did not want to do was stand up here and talk and pretend like I didn't know, or like nobody here knows. Like, obviously, this is a big deal, and it's a thing that a lot of us are probably processing and wrestling with, and I'm sure there are a lot of emotions kind of moving through the room, even now as we sit here trying to figure out, like, and if you've been here for a while, even if you didn't know Matt personally, I'm sure there was a certain amount of familiarity and comfort in seeing the same person up here every week. Ashley and I rotate out on the preaching, but you pretty much would always see Matt here in the same place, and so to no longer have that can be a little bit unusual. Like it can feel just sort of like a disruption, and so I did want to sort of just acknowledge that is a thing that we're all sort of dealing with. So as we move into the sermon portion, that this is something that probably is on a lot of our minds, and I didn't want to just go without it being acknowledged. I also just really quickly want to just acknowledge and recognize and kind of celebrate the staff. Because this is not only is this a group of people who work so hard and do so much to keep the wheels turning on this place every single week in ways that most of us probably have no idea all the different things that the staff members do. But also this week, not only did they have to continue doing that, they also lost a coworker and a friend and somebody that has been alongside them for a long time. And so, and that's a hard thing to have to deal with and continue doing your job. I've been on both sides of this. I've been working in churches long enough to where I've been the person who was told like it's time to move on, and I've been the person who had to tell somebody that. And it's bad, it's hard. And so to have to continue being here and to keep the engine of ministry running is no small thing. And our staff do such an amazing job, and they need to be recognized as often as we possibly can. And so if you get a chance to, on your way out today, if you see one of our staff members, give them a hug, or maybe they're not comfortable with that, or you're not comfortable with that, like a thumbs up is fine. But just some acknowledgement of like, we see you and we recognize that the work you're doing is not insignificant, and it does not go without being noticed. So anyway, I want to offer just a moment of prayer as we sort of try and transition into this next part of the service. So let's do that real quick. God, we thank you again for the space and the people who are gathered in this room. For those who are grieving the absence of someone who has meant a lot to many of us, we acknowledge that grief and all of the emotions that maybe are swirling around that as well. And we want to offer a moment, a prayer of gratitude for the people who come to this place and work so hard and pour so much of themselves into this community. We believe that the Well is a necessary and special place in Edmond, and we thank you for our staff who continue to make it work and to make it what it is. We pray that you would give them support, that you would give them comfort, that you would give them a sense of empowerment as we move forward. And may we, in the next few moments, may we look inside of ourselves, may we find some new way of experiencing the things that we're going to talk about, and may we see that there is more to the story than perhaps we've ever even known. In the name of Jesus we pray, amen. All right, so now we're going to try and transition as if nothing has happened. So we are currently in this series that we've been in for a little while called What a Terrible World, What a Beautiful World. And what we've been doing with this series is we've been trying to sort of address and live inside the tension between when things are difficult, when we struggle with things, and when things aren't difficult, when things are going the way that we want them to. There are moments when everything feels like it's breaking down, when things feel like they're disintegrating right in our hands. And then there are other moments where it feels like, oh, something great has happened and it needs to be celebrated. And a lot of times those two things live right next door to each other. And so one of the things that we've been doing with this series is we've been trying to figure out, how do we navigate that space? How do we honestly and authentically and in a healthy way engage those experiences in a way that make us more in tune with the story that God is telling, with who we were always meant to be. And so, one of the things we've talked about a lot in this series is that in lots of churches and in lots of traditions, we spend lots of time trying to direct people's attention towards happy things and towards all the good things, or we try and over spiritualize even the bad things so that they look happier than they feel. And so we end up sort of inadvertently creating this sort of like Ned Flanders branded version of faith that for a lot of us, that's a reference for those of us who grew up in the 90s and still watch The Simpsons. And so there is a brand of denialism that basically insists that if there is something wrong, if we're experiencing any amount of pain or discomfort or disruption, it's either our fault or it's not really happening at all because we're not really seeing the whole picture. And so if we start, anytime we start getting into darker, more troublesome stuff and like actually looking directly at it, which we've tried very hard to do in this series, there are lots of people who grew up in faith communities who do get kind of nervous with this. It's because we want to explain it away. We want to do something with it. We want to try and minimize it as best we can. We will say things like, well, it's all part of God's plan. Or we'll say something like, well, at least we'll minimize it by saying, well, at least this other thing hasn't happened yet, to which we would be like, yeah, but that actually doesn't make this thing any better. You know what I mean? Or we'll over-spiritualize it, which is like, well, God is trying to teach you something. Or just give it to God and it will be okay. Or my favorite, which is, have you prayed about that yet? There's all sorts of very unhelpful ways to engage things that are painful and things that are hard. And I think one of the things that we're finding, hopefully, throughout the series is like, oh no, actually the Bible is filled with poetry and stories and language about and by people who are willing to look directly into the hardest parts and not over spiritualize and dismiss and say, like, let's actually kind of name this thing and let's actually deal with it for what it really is, because things are not as easy or simple as our faith would sometimes prefer it to be when we really try to engage the scriptures as they are. So what we're going to do today, like last week, we talked about the first chapter in the book of Lamentations, which I think we can all agree was a pretty good time. And and so Lamentations is the most depressing book in the Bible, which is saying something. And so, and I'm sure many of you were like, well, we only read one chapter. There's 4 more. Let's go home and have a party and do like a around the room reading of the rest of Lamentations, and that'll just pick us right up and move us right into Monday. So what we did with Lamentations, though, Lamentations is a book of 5 poems, and what Lamentations is doing is it is acknowledging the destruction and abandonment of the city of Jerusalem. And it's these poems, they do not over spiritualize, they do not dismiss, they don't minimize. They are looking directly at this horrible thing has happened, and now we have to acknowledge it. And so Lamentations is a series of poems that are basically just digging into the most painful events in the history of this group of people, which was the Babylonian exile. So now what we're going to do, and hopefully what last week's sermon and this week's sermon will do, is sort of be like a little bit in communication with each other. And because what we're going to do today is we're going to continue looking at the Babylonian exile, which I know you were all hoping for. And we will, and so we're going to look at basically exactly what happened and what was the sort of the fallout for a lot of the people who lived through it. So the Babylonian exile, oh, by the way, I probably should say, we are going to be looking at a Bible story in a little bit that might traumatize your children. So if you would rather not have that happen, if you would rather lunch be a more peaceful, less awkward conversation, just wanted to let you know that now. So if they have an iPad, go ahead and give it to them. So there's... So we're looking at the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonian exile happened in 587 BCE. And the actual account of what happened occurs in the book of 2 Kings, beginning in chapter 25. And it does get pretty brutal. I cannot overemphasize. So in verse 2, it says, the city, Jerusalem, was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So Zedekiah was the king of Judea, which was the southern portion of all of Israel. So I know everybody's up on their their Israel geography from the ancient Near East, but I'll go ahead and give you a primer just as, just to be safe. So basically there is, in the entire territory of Israel, it has at a certain point, it was broken, not in half because the northern portion is much smaller, but the northern portion was broken off and began to just sort of in shorthand be referred to as just Israel. And the southern portion, which is much larger and contains the city of Jerusalem, was referred to as Judah. And so what happened was the portion that was Judah, including the city of Jerusalem, was under attack by the Babylonian Empire. And what we find in 2 Kings chapter 25 is the attack wasn't like the army's just going to come in and wipe everybody out. It's actually a lot more sinister and kind of more cruel than just that. And so it says the city was kept under siege. And what that means is basically the Babylonian Empire, instead of going in and just invading on the first day, what they did was they surrounded the city of Jerusalem with their army and just basically made it impossible for anybody to enter or leave the city, which means over time, trade is going to evaporate and people are going to begin to starve to death because you can't get food in and out of the city. And so as people become weaker and hungrier and more desperate, that's when you attack. So the siege was basically a way of being like, look, we can fight them when they're at their full strength, or we can just starve them out, and then we can fight them when they're all weak and starving to death. So Zedekiah at this time is the king of this territory. So the siege happens, and people eventually begin to starve to death. And then in verse 3, it says, by the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night. And so the whole army being the Israelite army. So the Babylonian Empire is like, okay, they're starving to death, they're weak, let's go in and kill everybody. And the Israelite army, who was supposed to protect everybody, was like, we're going to go. So they, now in their defense, their job was primarily to protect the king. And so they did take the king with them when they ran for their lives. So it says the city wall was broken through and the whole Israelite army fled at night through the gate between the two walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. The Israelite army, fled toward Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers, all the king's soldiers, were separated from him and scattered, and he, the king, Zedekiah, was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him, which is probably not going to go well for him. And so in the ancient Near East, if you're a king, and this is important, if you ever plan to be a king in the ancient Near East, you're going to need to know this. So if you're a king in the ancient Near East, you have two primary jobs. Job number one is you protect and lead your people, which I think we can all agree fail on that one. So that's your first job, to protect and lead your people. Your second job is to protect and preserve your own family's dynasty, which means when you become king on day one of your primarily points of interest is, I have to make sure I have a living son who will outlive me, who is able to take over the throne once I'm gone. That is a primarily point of interest for any king in the ancient Near East. It's about preserving family line, but it's also about preserving sort of like the chain of command. It's about preserving like legacy. Like every king is sort of measured by like what kind of legacy they leave behind, and a big part of that is like who took over which of your sons took over for you once you were gone. And so this is a big part. So the preservation of the king's family line is a huge part of what the king is trying to do in order to like continue moving forward and preserving the life of the people. So look at what happens in verse 7. So Zedekiah is taken, he's captured, he's taken to the king, and it says, and this is when it gets violent. So it says, the Babylonians, killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. So you get what's going on here? This is absolutely unbelievably cruel. So they make this guy, the king, watch as they murder his sons, and then they put out his eyes so that the very last thing he will ever see was the death of his sons, and tangentially, the end of his whole family line. So this is cruel, right? And this is a torturous, mean, cruel thing that they've done. So then in verse 8, it says, on the 7th day of the 5th month in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, which, by the way, the names here, if you guys are planning to have a kid and you're like trying to pick names, there's a lot to choose from here. So Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard and official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all of the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. So what's the strategy here? Why burn the temple, not just the houses, why the temple and every important building? What's the strategy here? Well, if you're one of these people, you believe, one of your primary beliefs, and this is not unique to Israel. This was the case in all of the ancient Near East. The idea was every major god had a temple. And the belief was it's not just the temple, it's like a place where everybody can sort of, like a convenient place where we can all just gather on like one day a week. The idea of the temple was this is where our God lives. This is the physical dwelling place of our God. So as long as the temple stands, our God remains alive and powerful. So once the Babylonians have come in and destroyed the temple, what is the message being sent? The message being sent is that the Babylonian army is more powerful than the God of Israel. This is a devastating message that they are trying to send. So this invading commanding officer comes in and he burns the temple to the ground. He ends not just the family line of the king. He doesn't just destroy the city. He ends basically any hope that this group of people is going to have that God will save them. So then in verse 10, it says, the whole Babylonian army under the command of the imperial guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. So basically, anybody who is still alive and able-bodied enough to travel, they're being put in chains and taken back forcibly to Babylon. So as all of this is happening, imagine you're one of these people. As all of this is happening, you're watching your whole world collapse, like everything you've known. Not just your house, not just like your job, but like your entire belief system, your entire sense of self-identity is evaporating right before your eyes. Everything that makes you who you are as an individual, as a society, it's all going up in flames. And it's disappearing right in front of you, and you can't do anything about it. So, by the way, one of the things that would happen was, and again, I've warned you, but they would take some of the smartest and more able-bodied young men. And because this is not the only time the Babylonians did this, but when the Babylonians would conquer a people and bring them into exile, one of the things that they would do is they would identify the more able-bodied young men, and they would castrate them. And if you don't know what that means, ask your parents. But so they would do that, and then they would change their name. They would take away their Jewish name, and they would give them a Babylonian name. So what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is if you take away this group of people's ability to reproduce, and then you change all of their names to Babylonian names, what have you done? You've erased their culture. You've erased them as a people. By the way, if you've ever read the book of Daniel is an entire book about 4 guys that this happened to. So this isn't just about taking your stuff. This isn't just about getting your resources or your supplies or your territory. This is about ending you. This is about any way that this group of people has to identify themselves or to separate themselves or to differentiate themselves from the rest of the world. All of those things are gone. Whatever faith they had in their God, it's over. Whatever connection they had to their history, it's over. All of it is gone. This is about ending you as a person, as a society. Any way that you could look in the mirror and recognize yourself, that's being taken away. So at this time, before the exile, there was a group of people who were Levites, who were musicians. And Levites, we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago. Levites were believed to be the direct descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, who was the original high priest. And so the idea was, if you're a Levite, you come from the line of Aaron, which means your job is to preserve and maintain and carry forward all of the traditions and religious practices that make you as a people. And so one of the things that they had was they had a group of Levites who were musicians. And the musicians, their whole job was to write and teach songs to the people so that they could sing about how great and powerful their God was. So they have all of these songs that they've been writing all their lives. All they've done is study Torah and write songs about how great and powerful their God is. And that's all they've ever known. So imagine being one of these musicians, and you've spent your whole life writing and teaching and leading songs about your God. And now you're chained next to everyone you've ever known, next to everyone that you know who is still alive at least, and you're being forced to go to a place that isn't your home. Your name has been changed. Everything you have ever known or loved has just been destroyed. Your temple has been decimated, which means maybe your God is dead, is the idea. That's the implicit assumption based in the leveling of the temple. So imagine you're one of these musicians. You spent your whole life pouring yourself into teaching people the songs of how great your God is, and now everything is gone. How would the world even make sense to you after that? So now there's a poem in Psalm 137 that was written by one of these songwriters. And this is what it says. In Psalm 137, beginning in verse 1, it says, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." And Zion is another word for Jerusalem. So he says, we sat and we wept by the rivers of Babylon. There on the poplars, and poplar's a kind of tree, it says, there on the poplars, we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? Which is not just saying like, well, I'm not at home, so I can't sing my songs. It's like, how can I bring myself to sing a song about a God that I believe in and that I love when everything that I know has been destroyed? When the God that I believed would protect me from these kinds of things didn't? How am I supposed to sing one of these songs? And so what do? It says they took their harps and they hung them in the trees. I've always found this to be such a powerful metaphor, just a powerful picture of hopelessness. There on the trees, we hung our harps, because why sing songs when we don't really believe in anything anymore? So I want to spend some time talking to those of us who possibly have hung up our harps. Because there are times when we go through things and it hits us really hard, or it shakes us so deeply that we actually stop even engaging with our lives. We stop being who we always thought we were. We hang up our harps in the tree branches. I've had a couple of times in my life when I truly felt like I did hang up my harp, at least for a minute or two, if not longer. The first time, interestingly, is when I was fired from a church job. But also, that wasn't really the thing. It was, that was a major impacting event. But the thing that was happening in the middle of that was I was also going through, very quietly, I was going through a season of full-blown faith reconstruction. Like, really, like, everything I think might be wrong. And so I'm kind of just, like, pulling everything apart. And then in the middle of that, there is the loss of this job. And there becomes the sense of, like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why I do any of the things I do. I don't know what I believe. So why do anything? So that can be a really disorienting thing. If you've ever been in a place where it felt like everything that you always sort of just assumed would always be there wasn't anymore. Like, that can be very jarring. And I remember very, very specifically, I can remember moments having that feeling of, like, yeah, I think I've hung up my harp. I think I'm done. I think I don't really have any more energy to give to anything anymore. That was the first time. The second time was kind of like early COVID times, because there was, okay, remember when I said last week, like, sometimes we have to overshare? Hang on. So I realized very early on in the middle of quarantine, and I realized, like, some of y'all are like, quarantine? What was quarantine? Listen, some of us stayed in our houses for a really long time. I realized not everybody did. But so we were, like, I had been pastoring this church for a long time that we had started and poured everything into. And all of a sudden, we're having to do this over, like, Zoom. I'm having to pastor this church over Zoom. I'm having to preach sermons into a camera in my dining room. And I'm spending a lot of my time just in my house when I would have been, like, doing work, and realizing, like, when I don't have a lot to do, that a lot of other things begin to sort of, like, pop up. And you begin to sort of, like, see things that you never really wanted to see. And so I started seeing a therapist over Zoom. And it took maybe, like, 1 or 2 sessions before the therapist said, it sounds to me like you've been dealing with, like, crippling anxiety for a long time, and that anxiety has created, like, a deep level of clinical depression. To which I was like, oh, great. Because actually, weirdly, it did feel better when she said that, because I thought, like, oh, there's a name for this. You know what I mean? Like to be, because like we talked about last week, when you can name something, it actually gives you some amount of power to address it and to deal with it. So, but realizing like, oh, I have been masking from myself the reality that I am really struggling with my own mental health, but I've been masking it by doing lots and lots of work. And so when I can't leave my house anymore and I can't do work, then all of a sudden I've got time to just sort of like notice these things that I've always been trying to avoid. And so what it did was it sort of it kind of created a spiral towards like what am I, like, because all like living through that did not create less anxiety, weirdly, and because not only was all that going on, but because of the circumstances, the church that we started began to kind of slowly die, and because it was a small church, and like not doing services in person for a long time for a small church can be devastating. And by the way, and this isn't even part of the sermon, I realize I don't even have time to tell you this, but I'm going to. But when we were just about ready to go back to in-person services, there was a massive freeze all across the state of Texas, which caused all of the pipes in the building that we were renting to burst all at the same time. And it absolutely flooded our entire sanctuary, which delayed our reopening by about 10 weeks, which absolutely any hope that we would have had to like regain any sort of momentum before Easter, it was gone. And so by the time we were able to reopen, it was just like, oh, this thing is just, it's not going to make it. It became very clear, like we are really about to crash and burn here. And so anyway, there are those seasons where you're going through a thing, and it's like this one thing happened, but then this other thing happened on top of the one thing, and it begins to kind of snowball, and it has this cumulative effect of, what, like, do I need to get up and shower today? Is that really a thing that's important? Like, or can I just like stay here in bed and do nothing? Because that actually sounds pretty appealing. What is that? I hung up my harp. Because why not? When you're sitting by the rivers of Babylon and there's nothing, like everything that you poured yourself into, all of a sudden it's just not working anymore. It's not there anymore. The map that you were given that told you if you just follow these steps, it'll take you to where you want to go. It's not going there. What do? Well, yeah, a lot of times for a lot of us, we have to hang up our harps, because what else can we do? So it's possible that right now you are in a season in which you feel disoriented, or you feel disillusioned. Maybe you just feel out of energy. The fact that you're here at all is kind of a miracle, because you kind of feel like you're done, but you already volunteered to serve today, and you didn't have a good excuse to not. And so you're here, but it's like, oh, man, can we just be done? And so maybe there's just a complete absence of enthusiasm or energy. Maybe you just feel beaten down. Maybe everything has been a slog. Maybe everything is a battle, and you just don't have it in you to keep fighting all these battles anymore, and you're just done. I get it. Maybe you've just hung up your harp. It makes sense. It's understandable. And for a lot of us, that's the most honest thing we can say about where we are right now. So this psalm, though, Psalm 137, is an acknowledgement that this is a completely normal thing for a person to experience. The notion of like, yeah, I don't think I have it in me to pretend like things are okay and to sing one of those songs that I used to sing. Like, I just don't have it in me anymore. Yeah, that's a very old feeling. People have been saying that for thousands of years. We've been wrestling with this type of thing for a long, long time. So our hope here at the Well is that this can be the kind of place where people can limp through the door and experience some amount of safety while they heal from some kind of past hurt, from some sort of disillusionment, or just a breakdown of what used to work, but now it doesn't anymore. Our hope is that this can be the kind of place where people who have hung up their harps can find a place to simply be, and maybe at some point find a way to reach up and grab for those harps, even for just a minute or two, back out of the tree branches again. We're going to look at a couple of dimensions in which the scriptures kind of invite us to maybe reach back for the harps, maybe at some point to go looking for hope in new kinds of places. So real quickly, so last service, the clock on the back wall wasn't working, and so I ran long, and I was able to blame somebody else for the fact that I was going too long. Now the clock's working. I have no one but myself to blame, and I'm really sorry. So anyway, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, you got this guy named Paul, and he's writing to this community in a city called Corinth. And the thing about it being 2 Corinthians is this is a conversation that's actually been going on, because there was a 1 Corinthians, and as it turns out, there were probably other letters that we don't even have anymore in which Paul was continuing to go back and forth with this this group of people. And at a certain point, he kind of calls them out. He's saying, like, look, we've been at this for a little while, and it seems like maybe you're holding back some things that you need to be, like, telling us. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11, Paul says, we have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak to you as to my children, which seems a little condescending, but whatever. It says, as a fair exchange, open wide your hearts also. What is he saying? He's saying, look, we put it all out here. Like we are being as open, as honest as we know how to be. We are showing you exactly who we are. And it feels like maybe you feel like you cannot meet us in that space. And he's saying, I'm begging you to please meet us in that space, to please be as open and as authentic with you or with us as we have tried to be with you. And so perhaps one of the ways that we hang up our harps is by closing ourselves off from engaging with other people. Maybe you went through something and you thought, I am never making myself vulnerable enough to go through that again. Maybe you were betrayed by somebody. Maybe you were rejected. Maybe you had an experience with someone and it turned out the person that you thought they were, that's not really who they were. And maybe you're having a moment of, I don't really know what to do with my relationships anymore because the person I thought I could trust isn't a person I can trust. This is not as safe a place as I once thought it was. And so it's possible you're having that moment of like, I don't know what to do with that. Like if you're familiar at all with the works of Brené Brown, which, by the way, highly recommend any TED Talk books, anything that she's written. But one of the things that she continues to kind of come back to over and over and over again is kind of this invitation to say, like, yeah, if you've been hurt by somebody, if you've had a relationship breakdown, if you've had somebody like take your trust and betray it, then yeah, it is totally understandable for you to guard yourself from that and to block yourself off from that. And she says, and it will. Like, you can absolutely protect yourself in that way. But the problem is, when you shut that pipeline off, it also prevents you from experiencing love, or it prevents you from being seen or known in the way that perhaps you deserve to be. So what Paul is inviting this group of people to do is he's saying, like, we want you to feel as seen and as known as we feel like we're trying to be with you. So it's possible to be surrounded by people and to feel completely unseen. And Paul is inviting these people to open their hearts and to be known. So that's one dimension of this. And again, I apologize for the time. But in Luke chapter 8, there's another story about Jesus. And it says, they being Jesus and his followers, it says, they sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town, which I think we've all been through. And then it says, for a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, which it's an odd description, but okay. It says, but he had lived in the tombs. So clearly, and I realize, like, anytime we start describing, like, telling Bible stories and there's like a guy who's got like a demon or whatever, it's easy for us to be like, okay, I think I'm out, because it's weird and it's confusing and it's not a thing that I recognize in any normal form in my own life, and so I don't know what to do with it. So let's just go ahead and sort of give ourselves permission to just be like, okay, let's just assume that whatever this guy's going through, he's deeply troubled. Like he is having troubles. And so this guy is clearly troubled and tormented by something. And so he's eventually healed by Jesus. And so if you go towards the bottom of the story, after he's healed by Jesus, in Luke chapter 8, verse 38, it says, the man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him, with Jesus, but Jesus sent him away, which, how weird that Jesus is like, no, that's okay, you can stay. You know, like, Jesus is like, even for the group of people that I hang out with, you're a little much. And so it says, but Jesus sent him away, saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. So what is Jesus saying here? He's not saying, I'd rather you not be with us. What Jesus is saying is, like, listen, you have a story here. You have an experience that you should tell other people about, because that's actually a certain amount of power that you have. Jesus draws some amount of strength out of the suffering person that this guy doesn't even realize is there. And so maybe the second dimension of pulling our harps out of the tree branches is, what if I just allow myself permission to tell my own story? Is it possible for your story to make you feel, or it is possible for your story to make you feel disempowered? It is possible for your story to make you feel damaged or broken or less than who you really are. Like, as if this is the thing that defines you. But what if the thing that makes you feel powerless is actually the thing that gives you power? Perhaps there's a strength that you don't even realize you have. but in telling your story, you will claim that strength. I remember a while back, I was at a long time ago, I went to a church service. It was a really big church in Dallas, and I wasn't working there. I was just there with some friends, and I went to this church service, and they had a guest speaker. It was a kind of a well-known guy, and he gets up to preach, and to be honest, the first 10 minutes of the sermon were pretty boring. I started thinking, like, I wonder what we should do for lunch. And right about the 10-minute mark, he said something. And he said, about 5 years ago, my wife left me for another man. And I was a pastor in my 40s at a large church, and I had no idea how to process that. I had no idea how to even begin dealing with that. And so all of a sudden, I'm not thinking about lunch at all anymore. Like, I am on the edge of my seat. I don't remember at all what he said for the first 10 minutes. Everything he said after that, I was all ears. Why? He's telling a story about the thing that has broken him, the hardest thing he's ever had to go through. And what does it do? Like, thousands of people in this room, and everybody's leaning in. Everybody is listening. Why? Because maybe the thing that did the most amount of harm, maybe the thing that you feel the most shame, embarrassment, pain over, maybe at some point, if you tell that story, that actually has a lot of power to it. You are an expert in your own experiences. And so Jesus tells this guy, go, tell your story. Because one way we reach for our harps is to claim our story. So maybe when you tell your story, it will remind other people that they're not alone. I know a lot of pastors who won't. I know a lot of pastors who are like, look, I'm only going to tell the good stuff. I want people to see me as like some sort of like infallible like guy who floats above whatever, and I've got it all figured out and together. And so that is one way to do it. Like, not every pastor is going to be like, I once had kidney stones. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so that takes a certain amount of, I don't know, like lack of self-awareness or something. But there is and by the way, it is possible to show yourself to people, to be authentic and vulnerable with people who are not safe people. And like, obviously we want to be careful and be aware of who we're talking to. But at the same time, like, yeah, tell your story. Your story has power. Find a way to go looking for ways that your story actually can bring life and comfort to somebody else. We'll look at one more. In Romans chapter 8, verse 22, this writer Paul, he says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. What's he doing? He's acknowledging, yeah, there's some sort of thing that we are all able to feel, like somewhere down, like in our bones, like there's an ache, there's a groaning, something here is not the way it was always meant to be. We're all familiar with this. And then he says, but we still hope for something. We still have some sort of, yeah, but if it's not supposed to be this way, what is it supposed to be like? And how hard would it be for us to reach for that? So maybe the internal groaning is your soul's way of saying, this isn't the way it's supposed to be. But the good news is it doesn't have to be this way. So one way perhaps that we can reach for our harps is maybe we can give ourselves permission to feel some kind of hope again. And I'm not saying like just flip it on like a light switch. I'm saying like maybe give yourself for 5 minutes a day, give yourself permission. I'm going to find something to hope for. I'm going to find some glimpse of sunlight in the midst of all this darkness. I'm going to go looking for it. Not to be false, not to be inauthentic, not to be in denial about the reality of all the other things, but just as a way of saying, like, maybe it doesn't have to be this way forever. Maybe this isn't the end of the story. Maybe this thing doesn't get to define me. So look at Psalm chapter 30. It's another one. It's another poem. This poet says, I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. Lord, my God, I called to you for help, and you healed me. You, Lord, brought me up from the realm of the dead. You spared me from going down to the pit. Sing the praises of the Lord, for you, his faithful people. Praise his holy name. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Or other translations say joy comes in the morning. What it does not say, like, nothing happens at night, nothing to see here. What does it say? Yeah, weeping happens at night. Like, there are dark nights of the soul. There are moments where it feels like, yeah, we have to hang up our harps because what else are we supposed to do? There is darkness and there is pain and there are things that we cannot fully verbalize that are very difficult to deal with. And the writer is not saying, let's ignore that. But the writer is saying, but our hope here is that it won't always be this way, that it doesn't have to be this way. Another way to say this would be, if you want a resurrection, sometimes it requires a death. So perhaps we're looking for ways to reach for our harps. Perhaps we're looking for ways to go looking for some kind of hope or some kind of, it doesn't have to be this way again. So to those who have hung up your harps, to those of us who feel just, again, discouraged, broken, beaten down, exhausted, your story isn't over. I hope at the very least you will hear that. Your story isn't over, and it doesn't have to be this way. You are allowed to feel hope. You are allowed to feel joy. Some of us have to be given permission because we think we're just past all that. We've hung up our harps and we haven't looked back. You are allowed to open yourself up. You are allowed to connect to other people. You are allowed to be seen. So may we go looking for ways to reach for our harps. May we go find ways to find hope. May we show ourselves, may we tell our stories to people who might find comfort in our stories. May we acknowledge that the darkness in the night can last a long, long time, but our hope is that there will come a morning. There will be joy again. So we're going to take communion. So I want to go ahead and invite the ushers to go ahead and start passing out communion. And communion is this interesting sort of thing because we spend a lot of time kind of pointing towards resurrection, which rightly so, we should. It is the defining event of our entire faith story. But the thing about communion is it's not a picture of a resurrection, it's a picture of a death. This is Jesus saying, this is my body broken and my blood poured out. So when Jesus says, do something to remember me, he doesn't talk about like pretending like everything's okay. He's saying, let's remember that there was a death in the middle of all this because you can't have a resurrection before you have a death. So if you want to take communion with us, you're welcome to. If you don't want to, you are more than welcome to not. That's completely up to you. The table is open to whoever wants to take communion. But this picture of communion is this beautiful picture of Jesus saying, I'm going to meet you in a space. And the space is not going to be a space of fake smiles and high fives. It's going to be a space in which there is brokenness and blood poured out. So Jesus is acknowledging, like, yeah, hanging up a harp, that's a big part of the story because you cannot have a resurrection without a death. So may we receive this with a sense of acknowledgement of where we are, but may we also receive this as saying this isn't the defining event of our story. The night can last a very long time, but hopefully there is joy in the morning. So if you want to take communion with us, I want to invite you to peel off that top layer. And there's a wafer on the inside. This is meant to represent the body of Jesus broken for you, for us. And Jesus says, I want to invite you to take and eat this and do this to remember me. And then in the same way, I want to invite you to peel off that second layer. There's a little bit of grape juice underneath there. And this is meant to represent the blood of Jesus poured out for you. And Jesus says, take and drink, all of you. Do this to remember me. We remember Jesus, not by pretending like everything was okay. We remember Jesus by acknowledging the body broken and the blood poured out. If you have hung up your harp, I am so sorry that has happened. I'm so sorry you have found yourself in a place of exhaustion, of disorientation, of desperation, of brokenness. I've been there. I think a lot of us probably have. May you find ways to reach for your harp. Again, may you acknowledge, may you never deny the reality of what you're going through, but may you find a way to go looking for joy in the morning when you're ready. May you give yourself permission to reach for your harp again. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this space and this time. For those of us in the room who are carrying around a sense of brokenness, for those of us in the room who are angry, for those of us who are discouraged, for those of us who are beaten down and exhausted, for those of us who have hung up our harps. May we take a deep breath. May we center ourselves. May we find that there is more to the story than the thing that we feel as we sit by the waters of Babylon. may we acknowledge all of the things that have brought us to this place, all of the things that have made us limp. And may we go looking for ways to reach for our harps again. May we feel the courage to tell our story to people who will listen. May we be seen when we need to be seen. May we go looking for opportunities to see hope and joy. May we go looking for even the smallest peak of sunlight in the middle of the darkest of nights. May we reach for our harps. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.